It is great to be here. I've been watching Frasier for years, so I know exactly what to expect. Somebody asked me, do you live nearby? I actually live in New York. I'm originally a West Coaster, though, so I feel some sort of affinity for the lifestyle and the values and the appreciation of things green, which are a little bit rare on the East Coast. Thank you all for coming, and thanks very much to Rich Lang and to the University Temple. It is great to be here. I think we're all in, if I can say so immodestly, for a treat because I don't actually know what I'm going to say, which means that I'm going to enjoy the surprises as we come along, as well as everybody else. Now, the reason for that is because I'm out there day by day talking to people and investigating, and there's so much coming into me that I sort of feel like my head is exploding. I could write up notes, but any notes I had a few months ago from a talk would be completely irrelevant today because so much is happening so fast in the world. Everything really is quite a bit sped up. Usually when I give talks, I start and I tell a story of my fantastic voyage into the dark realm of politics. There was the adventure I had writing, researching, and then writing Family of Secrets. We've got some copies in the back there. It really sort of blew my mind because I had been involved in politics as a young man and then worked in journalism for many, many years, and I thought I knew everything. I thought I knew how things worked, and I discovered that I really didn't. And so often what I do with these talks is I sort of share some of the things I discovered, but I have noticed that the crowd gets more and more depressed. And then by the end, somebody says, well, this is really riveting stuff, but what can we do about it? And at the beginning, when I started giving talks a few years ago based on Family of Secrets, I didn't know how to answer that because I wasn't really sure what we could do about it, but I've been thinking about it because I've been asked so many times, and I have now sort of figured out what we can do about it, and I'm going to go into that, I suppose, a little more at the end, but I'm going to start with the end of my previous talks and just tell you, here's what we do about it, and then you'll find out what it is a little bit later. What we do about it is we take an interest in the truth, and then we share that by persuading other people that they need to know these things, and then all of us together take action. What I mean by that is if you take your own situation, you're at home and there's water pouring out from somewhere and it's filling the floor and you're becoming concerned that there's something wrong and you're going to have a big problem. And I'm going to guess you don't say, yeah, you know, water, not an interesting issue to me. It's just too boring, you know. It's just, you know, it just doesn't. It's not the Kardashians, you know. I'm not gonna pay any attention to the water issue. What you do is you say, oh boy, I've got a water issue. I better study this immediately and figure out what's going on and what I can do about it, and then I better take action. And the truth is that when you know what's going on in almost any situation, you sort of know kind of what to do. If money is corrupting politics, you take the money out of it, you know. If climate change is leading us to extinction, then you take measures to change lifestyles and industrial output in order to address that. There actually are so many groups out there working to solve problems, and you know that. You're probably members of them. There are groups everywhere. There are thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of fantastic organizations working on every possible thing, and there are a lot of people with good ideas regarding what to do about them. So it occurred to me, as I said, over the years of being asked that question, what can we do about it? I realized the solutions are already there. The problem is that there's no action. And the reason there's no action is because most people are immobilized because they don't fully grasp the importance. They don't fully grasp that there are solutions. And I think they don't really understand how things work. And so what I'm interested in talking about is how things work. I became interested in it back in 2002, 2003. I was living in the Balkans, training journalists there in investigative reporting, and we were getting the first rumblings about a possible war in Iraq. It seemed very clear to me that they just wanted to go to war, and I wrote pieces saying that. And then the war happened, and living there, I noticed that the coverage of the war, I was able to get a lot more now you can get channels here, I guess, from everywhere, but back then you couldn't. But I was able to watch channels from all over the world, and I was struck by the difference, not just from Fox to these channels, but from CNN to these channels. And I said, my God, they're getting completely different stuff. And it just occurred to me that my own profession wasn't doing a very good job, or even a very honest job, of dealing with what was going on. And so the next thing that happened was everybody said, oh, well, George Bush either lied or somehow put out false information to cause a war. And there were no weapons of mass destruction. I'm sure you all remember that. And then I thought, well, he must be done for, because how could you possibly survive that? Well, by late 2003, early 2004, there he was running for re-election with good poll numbers. And then I saw that there was, who do we have, Howard Dean, and I thought, well, he's an impressive, articulate fellow. He ought to do well. And then it turned out it was going to be John Kerry, and I said, well, then it's pretty much all over, because here's Bush, where we've heard that he skipped out on his own military service, and here's John Kerry, this bemedaled war hero. And, you know, the war hero is, at the time, was, you know, more or less anti-war, and the guy who'd skipped out was pro-war. And I said, that's an easy one. It's going to be a walk. Well, it wasn't a walk. And then all these things started happening, like Kerry started having all these problems. And right when the focus was supposed to be on Bush and his being AWOL, they started looking at Kerry's military service. And they were alleging that he had somehow not really deserved his Purple Heart. And you know, he'd been in the Swift boats, but he had lied about some of that. And I was just sort of amazed at that. And then we had this, the Swift boat veterans, remember those ads and so forth. And then there was that big explosion with Dan Rather and CBS News, which was about how the media was falsifying something, not about how Bush was falsifying. And I thought, somebody's up to something here. And they're very, very good at it. And I thought, you know, maybe there's another way to look at how these things happen. Kind of don't take it on a retail level, but look at it a little bit more behind the scenes. And that's what I started doing in 2004, and that's what got me writing Family of Secrets. Around the same time, I also started a nonprofit organization, Who, What, Why, without any funds or resources, just because I thought, oh my God, I got to do my part to save the world. I mean, the journalism is not leveling with people. They're not telling them the truth. And if you don't tell people the truth, you know, it's like they say that you need clean water to, there are seats up here up in the front. Please come up and be my friend. There are, you know, they say that a village needs clean water or the village dies. Well, a democracy needs clean information or it dies. And this is what occurred to me, is that we don't really understand what's going on. And I know that because I didn't know what was going on. Now, if you read those Amazon reader reviews, there's always people who write, I read Family Secrets, it's pretty good. Of course, I knew all of that already. And I thought, well, that's amazing that they knew all these totally secret things. And they didn't actually know it, but many of us has this idea that we know that everything's pretty bad. So anything new that anybody tells us, we say, well, you know, it kind of fits with what I expected. But we do need to pay attention to facts, and we need to marshal facts, and we need to be able to go to that Thanksgiving dinner with, you know, Cousin Ed, who disagrees with us on everything. And we need to be able to articulately and without screaming, point out some things. And one of the exciting developments of all this is the tremendous response from people who are not what I would have considered to be my own kindred spirits, who are reading Family of Secrets, going to Who, What, Why, and saying, you know, I had no idea of this stuff, or this has changed my mind. One guy came to one of my events. He had been the commander of the United States nuclear fleet, an admiral. And he said, I'm pretty skeptical of this stuff, but I'm listening to you, and it's interesting, and you seem like an articulate guy, and you're not drooling. And so he was willing to take a stab at it, and he did purchase a copy of the book and start reading it. And I heard from others that he was very impressed by it, and it was changing his way of looking at things. Because you have to remember, when you are very close to something, you don't necessarily see the bigger picture. I think this is true of a lot of people in the military. I think it's true of a lot of people even in intelligence organizations. Everything is so compartmentalized. They're so regimented. They're so focused on what they've always been taught that it's very hard for them to step back and to think differently. So one of the things that I've been doing while I'm here in Seattle is to try to find out what's on people's minds, what people care about, what are the sorts of things that at Who, What, Why we ought to be covering, because our mandate is to cover the most important stories that exist. And apparently this is sort of a novelty, because if you think about the news, it's what I call the zone of low-hanging fruit. You know, I mean, did we ever hear a single news bulletin that actually gave us any information about that Malaysian plane? I mean, it's like they're running out the clock, you know, and, you know, Justin Timberlake did this, and, you know, the Kardashians did that, and so forth, and it's just, almost none of it is about anything, actually. And so we started talking about things like climate change and the growing plutocracy in this country, the fact that we elected a man who, what was it, hope you can believe in, or whatever his slogan was, you know, and you know, boy, but from that impassioned speech he gave in Lincoln Park to today, that's an awful long trip, and a pretty weird psychedelic one at that. Because he ain't the same guy. And then people say, well, you know, and so people either say, oh, I'm disgusted with him, or they say, I still like him. I still think he's a good man. And the problem is, he's not in charge. That's the thing that people don't get. And this is really what I discovered. This is what Family of Secrets is about, is that George W. Bush wasn't in charge either, because it's a culture. And there are thousands and thousands of people who are part of this particular culture, just like there are thousands of whatever culture you feel that you belong to, who are in another culture. And they work for police departments, and they work for corporations and that are involved with the military-industrial complex and so forth. And they have a very different view of the world, very different value system, very different appreciation of democracy, what it can be and what it should be. You know, their older relatives would just thought, you know, Francisco Franco was terrific, and you know, that Hitler had a few things to teach us, and so on. And so there's so much propaganda about how democratic America is. Have you noticed that? There's more flag waving. There's more. I was on a radio show a few days ago, and it was a liberal show, nationally syndicated, but the usual host wasn't there, and they had this guest host, and she announced her liberal bona fides, and then she proceeded to talk about the Boston Marathon bombing, which I'd like to talk about a little bit, which we've been covering extensively on Who, What, Why. And she said, and you know, they invited me on to talk about the Boston Marathon bombing. I assumed they had read my stuff. Well, I guess she hadn't, because she said, don't know about you, but I am wearing my Boston Strong t-shirt. And maybe she asked me if I was, and I said, listen, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I am just not into the propaganda and the myth-making stuff. I'm here to talk about what really happened in Boston and what it means about the way that they were able to basically declare martial law and force everyone to stay in their homes. This had never been done before in this country, that almost nobody spoke about it or asked about it or questioned it, not the media, and not most institutions either. Not all those great institutions of higher learning in the Boston area. Those should have been at the forefront of raising questions. They're full of constitutional law professors and so on. Nobody really said anything. And then almost immediately we heard that they'd solved this. Did you notice that? They always solve everything really fast. I mean, they do. They solve everything really, really fast. It's never like Columbo or Agatha Christie. They get it in a second. And so I was thinking, boy, that FBI is really good. I mean, they're so good. And then I thought, you know, when I was working on Family of Secrets and I discovered that George H.W. Bush couldn't remember where he was on the day that John F. Kennedy, when John F. Kennedy was shot, we could talk about that later if you want, or you could just read the chapters in the book about him and the Kennedy assassination. But I became interested in the Kennedy assassination, and I was struck by that the FBI was so incompetent that they had Lee Henry Oswald, they had Harvey Lee Oswald, they couldn't find the files, and I thought either they're incredibly incompetent or they're doing that deliberately, or some combination of the two, both, and any combination, all pretty bad. But guess what? Here we are 50 years later, and they're doing the exact same stuff. And we have an article on Who What Why I hope you'll take a look at about the report that just came out from the inspectors general of all these different alphabet agencies, where they are deliberately released at the time of the first anniversary of the bombing. And it's the most astonishing document, because if you read it very quickly, it's kind of boring and hard to fathom. You sort of get a sense that they say, well, they didn't do everything they could, but they did something, and there were some things we would do differently, and that's the end of it. By the way, that's what all reports say. You could just use the same report, year in and year out, because it always says the same thing. And so I thought, let me take a closer look at this. And then I realized that what these inspectors general were basically saying was their hands were tied. They couldn't really dig in. They themselves had been obstructed by these agencies. They had to black out or redact a whole section, the most interesting and important section, which had to do with what relationship, if any, might have existed between the U.S. government and the alleged bombers themselves several years prior to the bombing. Well, you would think people would be interested in it. The media was not interested in this. Nobody seemed interested in that. Well, yeah, they knew them, but they didn't know them that well. I mean, hello. I mean, it's just incredible. They'll lock a young black kid up for, allegedly once looking at a joint, and yet here you've got, the fire is awfully thick, not just smoke, but the fire's right there. And they say, yeah, well. And so I was looking at this, and I saw that this one FBI agent who had been interacting with the Tsarnaev family, I particularly loved this story, because when they wrote about what he did, here's what he did. The Russians said, we have some information about this kid and his family, and we think that he's involved with some sort of terrorist activities, and we urge you to take a look at him. Now, I mean, that's pretty much all the U.S. government seems to be in business these days, is homeland security. So you would assume, well, they jump right on it. Well, and I was thinking, well, what would I do if somebody tipped me off that there was a potential terrorist in our midst? So let me ask you quickly, what would you do if you got a report that there was a potential terrorist in your midst? What would you do? You'd investigate him. Okay, and how would you do that? By the way, there's probably one of you who does, but that's okay. Because they always like to come to these things for enlightenment purposes. Sorry? Okay. See, now, look how intelligent this man is. So he's already qualified to be the director of the FBI, because none of them thought of that. So what they did instead, they didn't put him under surveillance. You know what they went? They went to talk to him, and they said, are you a terrorist? I kid you not, you have to read this, And then they went to their neighbors and they said, is your neighbor a terrorist? And they were like, no, I don't think so. Girlfriend? No, not that I know of. Okay, clean bill of health. I swear, this is what happened. And then I think the Russians indicated that, he was going to maybe go to Russia or Chechnya and so forth. And he goes. And when he goes, there are normal flags that are supposed to be raised, and I know because they harassed me at the airport, and so they did nothing to him. And when he was coming back through, somehow the border people who were monitoring, who knew a little bit about him, the flag was taken down. In other words, he was supposed to sail through. And this is very, very important, because 9/11 was almost the exact same thing. All those guys were given those visas and stuff, and Michael Springman, the U.S. consul, was objecting over the years to all of these guys who were, and he was saying, I don't, they're lying and they want visas, and I can tell that this is not kosher, a funny term to use in Saudi Arabia, but anyway, and the higher ups just ordered him to admit all these people. And that's how we got them all, in the U.S. Training to fly planes.
I'm Mike Springman. Some 15 years ago now, I was chief of the visa section at the CIA's consulate at Jeddah, Saudi Arabia. People were being brought there from all over the Middle East for visas to come to the United States. And I was told they were terrorists that were recruited to come to the U.S. for training and shipped back to Afghanistan for fighting the Soviet soldiers. I thought that, this was really strange, but I couldn't explain it. And then when Trento and these other people started talking to me, and I said, well, this explains the whole thing. The reason why there was this pressure, the reason why these guys who were not businessmen, who were not educated, who were essentially low-level clerk-type people, supermarket checkers, guys who worked in an auto parts store, why visas were being demanded for them. And, when I put the pieces together from my three contacts, it was people who were brought here, who were recruited by the CIA and its asset Osama bin Laden to come to the United States for training as terrorists and to return them to Afghanistan to fight with the Soviet soldiers there and kill them.
And so it's a very similar thing again that they let these guys in. Now you say, well, what could possibly be going on here? And it seems to me, after years of studying this stuff, that really here's how it works. How does the FBI have such an incredible track record? How is it that they're always able to nail somebody? Anybody want to take a guess? They set them up. Okay. Something like that. Basically what you do, they remember the motto, the FBI always gets its man. And then it occurred to me, they always get their man because it's their man. They know these guys, they're in cahoots with them. They're going out for beers with them. And so it's a great system, but it's a kind of corruption. And it's just like, you go to have you take your car to the mechanic and, it's a racket, right? And they flip something, they tell you, oh, you need this and you need that and so on, and it's often not true. Well, it's not just car mechanics, and there are many honest car mechanics, and perhaps more higher percentage of car mechanics than people in one of these agencies, But it's easy to kind of dump on them, because they don't have the same kind of lobbying power. But if you look at the FBI, they do this stuff all the time, and they get away with it all the time. And to get a sense of why that is, you have to take a look at, let's say, Dianne Feinstein recently complaining that the CIA was going into the senators' computers. Other people telling either publicly or privately that they've been threatened. I remember one U.S. senator once said to me, Russ, what do you think is the biggest industry in Washington? And I said, well, is it government and then maybe lobbying? And he said, maybe, but I would say the most powerful industry in Washington is sexual blackmail. Because we live in this kind of fantasy of perfection, that everybody is, happy with the 10 kids they have, and that their marriage is fantastic, and they go to church regularly and so forth. And so there's nobody who's, a kind of a flawed human being as in terms of the way that they have to sort of campaign and present themselves. And so it creates an impossible situation. There are how many people still in high levels of politics who are closeted, can't talk about their sexual orientation. And it's a real problem. And so they're all sort of trapped. And as you know, if you've ever read any books about J. Edgar Hoover, he was very much in the blackmail business, especially since he was able to stay in the closet, dress up in women's clothes all those years and then harass gay liberation people. So very interesting situations. And this gets me back to the importance of what we're trying to do with Who, What, Why, which is to be honest. We don't consider ourselves liberal or left or right or conservative or libertarian or anything. We feel that our job is to figure out what happened, what's happening, and report it. And believe it or not, there are a lot of things you can do in journalism that involve objectivity. Either there are 3 people sitting in those chairs or there aren't. Either there's a guy running a camera or 2 guys running a camera, or they're not. Now, somebody could say, well, there's only 1 guy running a camera because I don't see anybody at the other camera. I would say, well, he's just he's kneeling down or something. So, these are things that can be factually resolved. And so, drones, do they kill the people that they're wanting to kill? And the people they wanted to kill, did they have any justification to kill them? These are mostly things that we can investigate and we can solve. And we think it's a real public service. And more than that, it's absolutely crucial to the to the vitality of the democracy, and indeed even to our future as a free country and as a viable civilization, that we do this kind of work. Anyway, I can go on and on and on. I have absolutely no idea how long I've been talking, but why don't we do this? I think Rich has this idea to break up into groups and chat. Do you want to do that now? Or do you want me to talk longer? Sure. Okay. Is that story interesting to you? Because I can talk about almost anything. I mean, that's just a very hot one. The reason I like that, it's what I would call deep politics in real time. You'll see in Family of Secrets that I discovered some really astonishing things about the Kennedy assassination, about Watergate, about a lot of these things. And I discovered that many of these traumas in this country are always presented as these complicated, convoluted things you can never get to the bottom of. It turns out you can get to the bottom of them. And most of them have the same cast of characters until those people pass from the scene, and then their children seem to take on the mantle, and so this is what you call deep politics, which is the idea that there's politics and then there's deep politics. And what I mean is there's this sort of superficial stuff, Sarah Palin is annoying, or Dick Cheney is evil or something like that. But that's the kind of, I call that the cartoon version of history. The reality is these people don't operate on their own. There are groups of people who say, who should we run? Dick Cheney was told to become the CEO of Halliburton. I mean, he was on a hunting trip, and the guys came in and said, Dick, we decided you're going to be the CEO of Halliburton. He said, oh, okay. And then, they decided somehow he's going to be vice president. And so these people don't do this in a vacuum. There's a whole sort of culture and a system that perpetuates these things. And what frustrates me is that when you talk about these things, they attack you. And they use these pejorative terms. My favorite one is conspiracy theorist, which actually doesn't mean anything. It just means you don't accept the conventional version. Now, of course, there are people who, as they call, I was recently in England, they call them the nutters, which are people who just always assume some convoluted scenario and that nothing is ever as it appears, which is not right either, or some just incredibly fantastic thing that you could never figure out how that would possibly be done. But there are a lot of things that are not the way we're told, and it is the instinct of institutions of all kinds to cover up. And this is not surprising. I mean, if any of you have children, you don't tell the kids everything, do you? No, so you're sort of covering up, or you wait until they're old enough or something. But you have to think about that. The U.S. government says, let's wait until the American public is old enough, and then we'll tell it. So they just don't. We're never old enough, and they can't tell us. And so it goes back to stuff like that, the polio vaccine, where, do you remember that, the first round, and they gave it to all these kids, and they got polio. I'm trying to remember, wasn't Salk, but one of these doctors in New Orleans wanted to show how safe it was, and he gave it to his kids, and they got polio, and so they were all horrified, and they had to cover this up because it would just destroy them, the faith in the system, and so on. And so this is always going on, and that's the importance of doing the journalism. Anyway, Boston bombing, real-time deep politics, because that first week, the second I heard that this thing happened, I went, oh boy, because I don't know what it is. Maybe it's so many years of looking at those color-coded alerts, and then they don't turn into anything, and the timing of them always around elections and things like that. And I thought, these people are taking advantage of us, and they're using, they're tightening the screws at key moments, and why wouldn't they do that? That's a very valuable control mechanism. And so looking at the Boston bombing, somehow, because I had been thinking that ever since 9/11, there really were zero, as far as I know, real terrorist attacks on U.S. soil. Now, you have to think about, they all tell us we have to be afraid of Muslims, but how many Muslims live in this country who didn't commit a terrorist act? Millions of them. I meet them every day in New York City driving cabs and, give me a sandwich or something, and they're basically pretty nice, law-abiding people. And so I thought, what was this all about? And I thought, how do they sustain this? Because if you go back to the early 90s, anybody remember the peace dividend? Anybody remember that? It didn't happen. We were told that's the end of history. Remember Francis Fukuyama or whatever, and the end of history, and it's all over now. And swords shall be beaten into plowshares and so forth. And it didn't happen. And in fact, there was no reduction of any note in the military spending. And then in addition to all of that and all the foreign threats, then we got Homeland Security, this giant boondoggle, which is the greatest cash cow for all these companies. And by the way, I encourage you to, if you have a stock in any of these outfits or something, just read the annual reports from these companies, because they actually say, people are afraid and the world's in chaos. Looks like it's going to be a pretty good year for us. They basically say that. And so anyway, so the Boston bombing. So I don't know what happened to me. I just get these instincts, and I was just reading somewhere that instincts aren't real. They talk about the debate over noetic sciences. I don't know, but I get instincts all the time, and they're probably not instincts scientifically. They're probably, you collect a lot of data and it processes somehow. But anyway, whatever it is, that as soon as I heard about that bombing, I was like, oh my God, I get a bad feeling about this one. It's too perfect. It's tax day. It's what they call Patriots Day. It's the Boston Marathon, this, hallowed family event, in Boston, the home of the American Revolution. And these bombs go up, and I say, oh boy, I got a bad feeling about this. So the next day, we were doing some fundraising, because Who, What, Why is we don't take any corporate money. We're a nonprofit, so all the money comes from folks, regular people. And so I was talking to somebody who's involved with fundraising at a large university, and she was sort of going to give us some advice. And then she said, what do you think about that Boston bombing? Do you think there's more to the story? And I paused, and then I said, I do think there's more to the story. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, from my experience, I wouldn't be surprised if it turns out that whoever did it, or whoever we are told did it, turns out to have more connections than they will admit, and that there may be some more awareness on the part of the authorities than they're going to admit. And this woman became so angry at me. I mean, she's like 92 years old, and she's still working, and she's a big, liberal Democrat, and she just began almost like shaking, and she kind of wanted us out of her place. And later we were downstairs meeting with her staff, and she came in and she said, we have other things to do. And, she wanted us out. It's very upsetting. This stuff is very, very upsetting. It causes cognitive dissonance, and particularly for people who are out there waving flags all the time and saying my country right or wrong and so on. This stuff just doesn't compute. It rubs like, fingernails on a chalkboard. And so people they fight this stuff, and they call you names, or they just become furious. But I had a feeling, and then the next day nothing happened. You remember there was, very briefly, they said there was a Saudi guy they had held, and there was another guy who just disappeared. And by the way, they found his body in a river. That story was never followed up on. These are all people who were early mentioned in relation to the story. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, people are nervous. The media is doing its usual Malaysia Air style non-coverage. Nothing's going on. There's this weird thing on Wednesday. They suddenly announce that they have some suspects, and they're at the courthouse, and suddenly there's a bomb threat. And the courthouse is evacuated. Nothing ever comes of that. That was weird. Thursday, nothing's happening. And suddenly, 5 o'clock, whoop, there they are. Do you remember that? It just, if you had your TV on, suddenly, just out of nowhere, they go live to this press conference. And there's the head of the FBI office there. And suddenly, they got these images up there. Very incriminating images. People at a sporting event wearing hats and backpacks. Wow. But I sort of looked at that, and then I noticed that everybody else had hats and backpacks. I wasn't sure what it was about these guys, and they said, these are suspects. And I thought, well, why are they suspects? That's interesting. And they said, we don't know who they are. If anybody has any information, please come forward. That was 5 o'clock on Thursday. Later in the evening, we heard suddenly that a police officer had been shot. And I was like, oh my God, that's like the Kennedy assassination. Remember, they didn't know who had shot the president. Suddenly a police officer is shot, and then they identify, supposedly Oswald dropped his wallet. I mean, shot the guy and left his wallet and his business cards so everybody could get in touch with him, And, this was sort of similar and kind of weird. Oh, and then a little later, carjacking. And then this guy escapes from the car, and the first thing he does is he says, this guy carjacked me. but it wasn't enough that he had a gun. I don't know about you, but if a guy has a gun and he carjacks me, I'm pretty much going to do whatever he wants. But apparently that wasn't enough, so the man had to say to him, do you know who I am? And he said, you're a guy with a gun. He said, no, no, no. I'm the Boston Marathon bomber. And he said, oh, I also just shot a police officer. And I thought, that is the weirdest darn thing, you know, because honestly, you know, you want the driver, if you're carjacking him, to just kind of be calm and not imagine a larger scenario, just that he wants to drive you and that's it. So that seemed very strange to me. And then we began looking at all these things. We looked at the shooting of this police officer. They made a huge big deal about the fact what a hero he was, a first responder, they say. A year later, they still say, it's all a lie, and it's disgraceful, and it really is tragic because obviously his family, I'm sure I can't talk to them about this because they want to be proud of him. Well, they should be proud of him because he was a good police officer at MIT, and the kids liked him, and that's enough. But he was not a hero in anything. This original story they put out, and if you ask people what happened, they say, oh, they shot him in a, you know, he was trying to stop them. And, you know, that's not what happened. It took days and weeks for this to come out, and almost nobody knows the real story. The real story is not only did he not confront them, he never saw them. And, you know, they finally said, oh, well, he was sitting in his car on the street and they came along and they wanted to take his gun. Well, that's not what happened either. What happened was he was sitting in his car wedged between buildings on a completely dark campus. Now, why would they even be on the campus? You're fleeing for your lives, supposedly, the FBI showing your pictures, and you're going to go to a darkened campus to see if you can find a cop sitting between two darkened buildings, and then you're going to shoot him in the head and not take his gun? It doesn't make any sense. And so what we do at Who, What, Why is we just go, you know, I like to say I went to the Colombo School of Journalism. I just go, like, oh, you know, I just don't quite, I can't see, I mean, I can't quite, you know, why? You know, it doesn't make any sense to me. It doesn't make any sense to me. And so that didn't make any sense. And then this took me almost 9 months of looking at the story of the carjacking victim. By the way, who knows the name of the carjacking victim, since he's the one who was the recipient of the confession? Anybody know their names? His name? Danny? What's his last name? It's just Danny? What's your name? Devin, do you have a last name? Oh, what's Danny's? See, isn't that a little strange? We don't know Danny's last name. It actually turns out Danny is not his first name. Until recently, something weird is happening again. They never showed his face. He was always in shadow. They altered his voice, and they never told us who he was. So here's the guy who has the confession. The reason we think those two kids did it is because of him.
Chinese.
And he used the Chinese to English translation app in your phone?
Yes.
It's kind of smart.
He was smart. He was very, careful.
Because otherwise, what did they show us? One guy got mad at me. This guy's a journalism professor who lives in Boston. He said, we know they did it. I said, well, how do you know it? He said, we saw them planting the bombs. So I said, you saw them planting the bombs? He said, it was all over TV. I said, wait a minute. What are you talking about? It turns out they never showed us them planting bombs. They've released some stills, and we'll have some articles about whether those stills are real or accurate and what they actually show. But it's just one thing after another. It's like they got an endless bag of tricks. And so you look at this stuff and you say, none of this adds up. This Danny, by the way, we found that he told different versions to different news organizations. In some, he was carjacked for 90 minutes, which is a really long time. You know, it's a small area there in Boston. Where would you go for 90 minutes? Another account was 60 minutes, which is still pretty long. Another one was 30 minutes. And another one was, get this, that he was not carjacked at all. He actually told that to a news organization early on. He said that they just took his car. It's astonishing. This is the biggest story in the country, and nobody seems to know any of this stuff. And so we write about all this, and we found many, many more things about that story. It goes on and on and on. I mean, it's truly staggering. You can see photos that have been altered, statements that they made that make no sense. We're working on about 5 or 6 stories right now, so I don't want to say too much about them, but it's really unbelievable. And for an investigative journalist, this is almost like a dream story, because it's like an Easter egg hunt. You know, the stuff that is wrong is everywhere. And yet nobody's looking at this. The media is not looking at this. And you could say, well, you know, I could ask you who you like. Public radio, not looking at this. Liberal weekly and biweekly magazines, not looking at this. Websites that are progressive, blogs with a lot of traffic, not writing a word about any of this. There's a complete silence. And for anybody who lived in Weimar, Germany, or lived in Chile or Argentina or something, this is a very terrifying time, folks, because nobody's doing anything and nobody's saying anything. There is a conspiracy of silence. And so I do want to start wrapping up here, but what I'd like to say is this: it doesn't have to be that way. It does not have to be that way. This is interesting. I think you'll agree this is interesting stuff. People who like to, you know, when you go on vacation and you see all those guys with the Marine stuff or whatever, and they're all reading thrillers about spies and the FBI and stuff like that, but it's all made up stuff. And you say, well, why not take the real stuff and pay some attention to it? Because it's really as or more interesting. It's pretty incredible. In fact, what I find amazing is that we are convinced we have very little free time. We have very little bandwidth for things outside ourselves. And so that time that we spend absorbing things, we're told to watch lots of movies with battles in them, you know, whether it's hobgoblins battling on some amazing set that cost $200 million, or it's people battling for their lives on a ship going down or something like that. We watch all these and we don't think about why we spend so much time on it. Sports, football, which is simulated battle. The wars on TV, which is, again, a kind of simulated battle with the drone strikes and all that. And then just the gossip, the amount of time that we all spend on things like this Pistorius case. I mean, I'm sorry that he shot his girlfriend, but I never even heard of the guy until recently. You know, we shouldn't really be spending that many hours debating, you know, these horrible stories with a mother who drives her kids into the water because it's a tragedy. But you know, we didn't know him. We can't do anything about it. It's not a policy issue. These are isolated cases of tragedy. And you can fill up all your time. We can fill up all of our TV and everything else with that stuff because you can always find those kinds of things. And I don't think it's an accident. I think it's deliberate. It's easy. It's low-hanging fruit. It doesn't expose news organizations to high costs or any kind of risks. And they love it. So what we're trying to do is get folks to say, you know what, I'm going to watch less of that stuff and so on. And what I'm going to do is try to find a way to make this real stuff interesting to other people. And I'm going to share it. And so what I think all of you can do at a minimum, and this is really, really easy, is use social media to spread the word. And also just talk to people. Go to events and talk to people. Because if each of you regularly talks to 3 or 4 people and lets them know these things, and you know, educate yourself, get armed with the specifics and tell the kind of stories I'm telling, people are going to find it interesting. I mean, I do it on my own level. You know, over the years I had lunches with the people like Dan Rather and whatever, and they would just say, wow, you're just, you know, you're blowing my mind. And now Dan tweets our stories, you know, after what happened to him, but still, you know, it takes him a while. We get notes privately. A guy at the Boston Globe sent me a note the other day praising something we had done. I mean, he'll never write a word, but at least he praises. So there's a food chain going on there, and I was describing us as we're sort of the phytoplankton of the information food chain. You know, everybody's got to eat the stuff, and it'll move its way up. So I'm going to stop with that, I guess, and I know we're going to do some Q&A.